Hello and welcome to another Glow Meets. This is our second Glow Meet today. I'm from the beautiful Synagogue here in Giffnock. My name is Joe Walker. I'm Senior Education Officer at Education Scotland, and I have responsibility for religious and moral education. These Glow Meets, we've entitled them Learning About Judaism and Jewish People, and the aim of these is to support your understanding and your career-long professional learning in relation to learning about Judaism for RME. We had a really successful Glow Meet just an hour or so ago for learners with some absolutely fantastic questions. And what we wanted to do with this one was to do one for practitioners, for you to be able, I suppose, to ask the kind of questions that you'd be less likely to ask with the pupils sitting beside you. So, feel free to ask questions on any aspect of Judaism that might help you in your understanding of it, and most importantly, in your delivery of it for young people, because what we're trying to do here is increase the impact of what you know in terms of supporting your learners to develop their understanding of Judaism. So I'm joined here today on my left. This is Zoe Jacobs, who's a Development Officer for the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities. And to Zoe's left is Ephraim Borowski, who is the Director of the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities. I'm just off camera at the moment, but will be coming in later on, is Marguerite Borowski, who's a member of the community here, and was a primary teacher in a past life, and working in a Jewish ethos school here in East Renfrewshire. We're going to start off by asking Ephraim just to say a little bit about the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities and the Jewish community here in Giffnock, and I suppose how that fits into the Jewish community in Scotland more generally. So if I could pass over to you, Ephraim.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. Just an overview of the community. There are, by our reckoning, around 10,000 Jewish people in Scotland. That's more than the census says, but we have evidence to support that. And we have explanations, unfortunately, of why there is a difference, because for a variety of historical reasons, Jewish people are allergic to telling officialdom that they are Jewish. Second reason, and this is more relevant maybe to the contemporary community, is that the Scottish census question asked people what faith community they belong to, not what faith they affiliate to. And that means that if you live outside any of the big cities in Scotland, there isn't actually a community to belong to, and you therefore truthfully, however religious you are, you truthfully say, I don't belong to any. So the fact of the matter is that there are probably around 4,500 to 5,000 Jewish people in the Glasgow area, something like up to 2,000 in Edinburgh and the Lothians, small communities based in Dundee and Aberdeen, and the rest are scattered throughout the whole of Scotland with, as I say, nothing to belong to. But even according to the census figures, there is no part of Scotland, no local authority, that does not have people who say that they are Jewish. And that's important, I think, from your point of view, because it means that you may not be aware of it, but within your school community, it's as likely as not that there actually are Jewish people, some of whom are not only not advertising the fact, but maybe actively hiding the fact, because sadly, anti-Semitism is still a fact of life in Scotland. It's not a major fact of life. It is not nearly as bad as it is in other parts of the United Kingdom, certainly much, much less bad than it is in Europe, but nonetheless, We have conducted research within the Jewish community in Scotland twice in the last 5 years, and we have discovered almost every variety of traditional historic anti-Semitism still lurking out there. It's not necessary, I think, for me to give examples, but it does show the importance of demystifying a well-entrenched community, faith community that has been in Scotland now for almost 200 years, but is still in many respects, unfortunately, seen as other. And that is something that needs to be overcome. It's relatively easy to overcome it in the big cities. A school can hire a bus and visit one of the synagogues, like where we are at the moment. It is much more difficult in rural areas where there isn't a local Jewish community, and where there is a tendency sometimes, if a school does know of a local Jewish family, to treat them as if they were experts. And that is both unfair to the family and inappropriate, and not really helpful to the education of the children either. Imagine that you went on a holiday to some remote part of Patagonia and they discovered that you were from Scotland and asked you to give an hour-long talk on some feature of Scottish history. You wouldn't be able to do it with adequate preparation. Unless you were an expert, you would feel embarrassed about doing it, but you would feel obliged to. And that is the way many of these people feel, and it just adds, unfortunately, to the sense of alienation and otherness that's reported to us. So we very much welcome the opportunity to participate in events like this, because it is an opportunity for people who do not have immediate daily access to their own local Jewish community to get informed and authoritative input into their teaching.
Okay, thank you for that. I think certainly during our Glow Meet for learners just an hour or so ago, one of the key issues there for practitioners in all school contexts, in all learning contexts, is I suppose it's two things. First of all is that issue about the potential stereotyping of both religious people and religions. All Jewish people do X or Y, which we saw, I think, quite clearly during that learning meet. Simply not the case. There's a variety of viewpoints within Judaism, and in fact, I'm sure Ephraim will substantiate this, that part of the reason for the existence, I think, of things like the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities is because there will be disagreements within the community. You can have that discussion within the community and then present, if you like, one view that comes out of that. Would that be accurate to say?
Yes, I think that's it in an absolute nutshell. The reason that the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities was established at the time of devolution was so that we could have our own discussions internally and then speak with a single voice to the new Scottish government, the new Scottish political stratum, and other stakeholders in civic Scotland, rather than what had tended to happen, which was that people who were pretending to consult would choose who to consult in order to get the answer that they would prefer to hear. And we now have a mechanism for ensuring that we do consult with all the parts of the community. We put draft consultation responses, for example, on the internet to allow people to respond to us internally before they go to government. And that includes all the strands of the community. It includes all the religious groups within the community as well. And we've been commended both by the Orthodox and by the Liberals for being able to put a single response in on really quite significantly disputed ethical issues, like, for example, assisted suicide.
So, I think in terms of that, that's one of the key messages that Education Scotland is continually trying to get across in religious moral education, is that we're talking there about diversity of community. And we don't just mean diversity of community within the Scottish context, but even within a religious community, there is that diversity, and there is that danger in RME that far too easy to do that stereotyping of all Jews do this and all Jewish people believe this, and we've seen that that's not the case. So this is part of that development, that career-long professional learning for practitioners to upskill ourselves and to learn more about what's happening now. Ephraim's mentioned, and he's quite right, you may not have access to a Jewish community. In fact, you may have, but you may not be aware of it. Or you may have access, but that may not necessarily be an authoritative viewpoint that you're getting, or it may be a particularly skewed viewpoint on something, so you need to be careful about how you handle that. So hopefully that's the kind of benefit that we'll have of events such as today. Jen is our director. She's over there on the other side of the camera. I'm just going to ask her just now if we've got any questions coming in.
Yes.
I've got a load of questions, but much more important, the questions come from you folks who are participating out there.
Could I just make one point based on what Joe's just said? There is actually a good side to what is in a certain sense stereotyping. And that is that we all want society to be more accommodating of diversity in the sense of tolerating and indeed welcoming other people's foibles, particularly obviously in our case religious foibles. Now, there is obviously a huge range of religious commitment and practice within a community like the Jewish community. But if other people are to understand the importance of, for example, kosher food or Shabbat or whatever it might be, they have to actually concentrate on the orthodox view rather than on the view of it may very well be the majority who aren't that bothered. And I think one of the lessons that has to come out of this kind of education for diversity is never ever to presume that any one person who sticks a label on him or herself is the same as the person whom you met yesterday who gave themselves that label. So if you're a nurse and you're dealing with a patient who says that he or she is Jewish, don't assume that they will accept the same food that the one you dealt with last week would accept, because they may have different standards. So the first lesson for me is always ask.
Okay. So, Jen, are we ready with some questions?
Yes, we do. We have one from Matthew Kavanagh, who's asking, following your comment about demystifying Judaism through RME, what are the most prevalent or most important misconceptions of Jewish culture that we, obviously talking as a teacher, might be able to combat through teaching in RME?
How many weeks have we got?
Great question, Matthew. Great one.
Excellent. And funnily enough, when I give a formal PowerPoint presentation, I've actually been told off in the past for starting with a slide of misconceptions. So a couple of starters. Judaism is not a watered-down form of Christianity. Parallel to that, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is not the Old Testament. It's not the Old Testament because the Old Testament is only old by comparison with the New Testament, which is not our Bible, but the Christian Bible. So I think probably the biggest misconception is a conceptual one. I suppose that's a tautology. And it's because whether or not we can have all kinds of arguments about whether this is still a Christian society or a post-Christian society, but the fact of the matter is that British society conceives of the world by and large through Christian eyes. And it will therefore, and this is quite natural and it's not in any sense objectionable, but we have to be conscious of it, we all very often see other things and other people by their difference from us and from what we're familiar with. So it's all very well to say that the Jewish Bible consists of the same books as the Christian Old Testament, but it isn't the Christian Old Testament because it isn't Christian. And the other thing to remember that goes hand in hand with that is that, of course, the Jewish Bible was written in Hebrew, not in English. So the King James Version or the Revised Standard Version or whatever your preferred Good News Bible might be is itself a Christian gloss of the original text. And it's important to keep that in mind. It's important to realize that some of your favorite Bible stories might actually not only be mistranslations, which is true in some cases, but even if they're not mistranslations, they're dressed up in a Christian theology which we would not recognize. So that's, if you like, the big one. Then there are very specific misconceptions, and one of the ones that I have to say, when I heard this really shocked me, was the number of times that we had people reporting to us that their children in this decade were being taunted in the playground because you, notice the finger, killed Christ. Now there's no excuse for that. Then there's the misconceptions that are to do with the prevalence of various forms of medieval anti-Semitic mythology. There's what you get from the extreme right wing. There's the carelessness of the extreme left wing about their use of the word Jew when they're talking about Middle East wars. And there's a huge range of different kinds of misconception, as you put it, mythology, simply historic inaccuracy, the people who may not actually deny the Holocaust, but doubt it, and worse than that, the people who abuse the vocabulary of the Holocaust and thereby belittle it. And all of these are things that we all have to be on our guard against.
I think one of the other things that that I often find, and I found really interesting when I was speaking to a teacher a couple of months ago, was when there are things that people know that Jewish people do, but they have no knowledge of why they do it, and therefore there's an assumption of a sort of a jump from what happens to why they do it, and these bizarre creations of why they do it appear. And so I said that Jewish people tend to live in quite small groups in terms geographically, because Orthodox Jews will walk to synagogue, and therefore it's useful to live near the synagogue, and therefore most people will live within a small area. And they went, oh, I thought it was all just because you didn't really like the rest of us and you were a bit like you wanted to keep yourselves to yourself. And it's like, nope, literally just a practical reason for living quite close. And so sort of funny things like that, making sure that not only do you know what we do, but knowing why we do it and finding the why from sort of someone, a source that you or we or someone has sort of said, good source, well done. Having both those information, so not just what we do, but why we do it, so that even if you don't agree with whatever we're doing, you understand why we think we should be doing it, rather than just coming to some sort of funny conclusion of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
In terms of career-long professional learning for staff, I was quite conscious when we were doing our Learner Glow Meet that you've both spoken about at that point. I think the Noah story and the Joseph story, and it actually struck me at that point. I wonder how many times young people in schools and early learning contexts are aware of the Jewish background and the fact that these are Jewish stories, essentially. And I just wondered, in terms of a CLPL approach, have we, when we're presenting these stories, which we will do in RME, as it's fairly likely to do so, have we got that awareness of a Jewish interpretation of it and how that might be done? So, I mean, in terms of our CLPL, I think that's a really key issue here in relation to being authentic about the religious tradition that we're actually exploring with young people in the class.
Nope, just hopefully more questions will be coming in soon. If you want to post something
Okay,
now.
fine. One thing I was going to ask therefore, and that's it's related to the authenticity question. A lot of practitioners out there will be asking themselves, how do I know, I've invited a person into school, it's a local Jewish family. How do I know that what that person is telling me is reliable, authentic and representative? Are there ways around that for practitioners?
I can certainly see the problem, particularly if somebody trots up to your front door and says, hey, would you like to hear from me about this? I think obviously if, like any cold caller, you first of all ask what their ulterior motives might be. If you've got any doubts at all, then another function that the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities can serve is to check out the bona fides of somebody who is claiming to speak on behalf of the community, because frankly, it would be extremely unlikely that anybody who had any authority to do so wouldn't be known to us. So if you want, pick up the telephone to us or email us, and we will check things like that out. There are, I mean, I don't wish necessarily to belittle everybody who is voluntarily giving his or her time in order to talk about Judaism in schools, but I think that somebody in a remote rural area who has no connection with the Jewish community whatsoever, almost on a mirror image of what Zoe just said, if being part of the Jewish community matters to them, then okay, they might not live within 100 yards of a synagogue, but you must begin to wonder why, if they live on an island that can only be accessed by 2 hours in a rowing boat, if the tide's in the right direction, why are they there? So if they trot up and claim to be authorities on Judaism, or for that matter anything else, you really should take that with a pinch of salt. And I think in this kind of area, for the kind of reasons that Joe has given, it's probably better to err on the side of being a bit more cautious, rather than simply taking what people say at face value.
We also offer volunteers who are trained to speak in schools and have the authority of the knowledge of all sort of the spectrum of Judaism, and will try and represent that accurately. So if you'd like volunteers to come into your school, we can help you with that. And they would also be able to, we do try and recommend that they specifically make distinct when they are saying many Jews do and I believe. Because there are plenty of variations within Judaism, and we encourage people to explain individual ideas, but we also want them to state quite clearly that personally I celebrate this festival by doing whatever, but also generally Judaism will tend to do blah, which is what we try and suggest volunteers do, and make that distinction quite clear.
There are a whole number of issues around inviting speakers into classes, and at the end of the day, I'm sure we're all agreed it's all about professional judgment. It's about using that professional judgment really, really carefully. We have actually produced a paper in Education Scotland, which is on our website. If you go to our RME section of the website, which is about using visiting speakers in a class. And again, I don't think there's anything there that isn't common sense, but there is that issue of making sure that you know what the message is going to be. You know what the person's representing, that you're exercising your professional judgment in terms of how they're addressing young people, and all of those usual safeguards. I think we're fairly clear about those. If I were then to home in on that just a wee bit, clearly in education we've got a lot to deliver. There are 8 curricular areas, there are 3 responsibilities of all, and even within one curricular area, such as RME, we could be delivering on a whole range of religious perspectives, or moral perspectives, and so on. If I were to ask both of you, what are the key things that practitioners there should be explaining to young people about Judaism? What are the key things that they should be exposing young people to in relation to Judaism? What would be the key things you would want young people to be learning about Judaism in Scottish schools?
Well, I can sort of answer from the basis of what we try and explain to our volunteers, and the sort of areas that we cover as the ones that are most likely people most likely to ask us about, which is sort of a reflection of not only what we think that we should be portraying, but also what people tend to want to know, which I think actually is possibly one of the most important things. Is if you've got a question, that's what we want to be answering, to avoid giving you information that is, you're like, that's nice, but that wasn't what I was aiming for, is the Jewish festivals, on the basis that they tend to be the bedrock of most sort of traditional life in the sort of yearly cycle. What's going on? What are we preoccupied by? What are we doing in our daily life? So sort of the Jewish festivals and the Jewish life cycle. So particularly within schools, as pupils come to sort of 12, 13, in a Jewish environment, they'd be going through a bar or bat mitzvah, and that's a really nice sort of time to look at a Jewish rite of passage, and possibly in comparison to other religious rites of passage. And we tend to look at the synagogue as well, not only as the building, but also sort of the place it has in Jewish culture. And lastly, kashrut, so the kosher foods and other sort of daily bits and pieces of life. So if that's Jewish clothing or Jewish food or whatever, that kind of thing. Because I think that tends to cover both the Jewish beliefs, so the sort of internal belief structure in terms of what motivates us to do those things, and also the consequential actions, and sort of getting that balance of going, what are these people believing, and therefore what are they doing? So I think getting that balance over the festivals, the life cycle, sort of food and daily life, and the synagogue are the things that I tend to focus on as the ones that will cover from sort of P1 all the way up. There are access points for all those.
I think it also connects with what Zoe said earlier about putting the rituals, for want of another word, into a context that offers some kind of explanation or rationale. And obviously the balance there is going to depend to a large extent on the age and capacity of the pupils. So it's, at one level, you might want simply to say, this is what Jewish people do, just so that if you come across a particular, somebody dressed in this way, or somebody who doesn't want to share your food, or whatever it might be, you have some sympathy with their practice. You don't think that this is completely outlandish. But as children get older, they will start to ask, well, why do they do this or not do that? And then it becomes more important and possibly more difficult to try to explain that, because it's essentially impossible to get inside somebody else's head. So trying to explain a Jewish ritual from the perspective of Judaism is not necessarily very easy for somebody who isn't themselves Jewish. And that, I think, is something also that's got to be borne in mind, that in a sense, whoever does it and however well they do it, they're never actually going to score 100%, because the task itself is impossible. I can't describe your pain. You can't describe my reasons. So I think within that caveat, we can simply try again to demystify what we do and what we believe by putting it within a context, and perhaps by inviting other people to take a step back from what they do and they believe, and asking them, well, you know, if somebody asked the same question of you, how would you answer that? Not necessarily simple.
I think, again, that's one of the things that we continually stress in Education Scotland, is about that depth of learning. I think there's that tendency, particularly in RME, which is not always people's background in the primary school, and even sometimes in secondary there's very specific focus in a specific area, but there's sometimes that tendency to be very, very superficial and not actually to engage, and that's something that we're continually stressing in Education Scotland, is the importance of getting underneath the skin of some of these things, not just the outward appearance of, not just the objects and the buildings, however important they are and however meaningful they are, is trying to get underneath that and try to explore with young people and make the links with young people as well between the experience and the expression, if you like, of being Jewish, and the experience and expression of being, well, anything else for that matter, and make those links across there.
That ties in very well.
Yeah.
We've got quite a lot of questions have now come in.
Good,
so
good,
we'll
good.
try and get through as many as we can. And just tying in with that one, thank you for the questions that have been posed. I will be able to ask them all. It's Margaret Matheson, she's asking, again, but you're talking about, how do you ensure depth of meaningful learning whilst at the same time being sensitive to parental views? Also, how do you ensure the depth of meaningful learning with regards to early years pupils? So it's,
I think one of the things is the emotion. So not only finding out what does a Jewish person do on Shabbat, but what does it mean to them? Why are they doing it? How do they feel? And particularly with early years, you can talk about the sort of the senses and how what you're doing with Shabbat, and is it peaceful? So taking deep breaths in and deep breaths out and being with a family. But if you're speaking to a Jewish person, then go, how do you feel about that? And getting that sort of side of it. So looking at the different emotions to do with different festivals. So actually at Yom Kippur, it's quite solemn, we're thinking a lot, it's quite internal, versus at Shabbat, it's a very family affair, most people are happy and relaxed. And so looking at not only what we're doing, but sort of the experience of it, I think can then relate to each person individually and going, okay, when do you feel relaxed? When do you focus most on your families? And whether that is a tie-in, dare I say it, to Christmas, of saying actually that's the time when you are with your family and you do feel relaxed. When is the time when you are most thoughtful? And so tying into the human element of everyone's emotions, because that is a bit that most people will share, and you can sort of tap into that aspect.
And what about the parental side of things?
I think it's an awkward one. I think one of the things is making sure that at every opportunity you're saying, like, this is someone else's opinion, and that's important to learn. And that's not just about religion. So if parents are worried about, we're talking about Judaism, oh my goodness, my child's going to be Jewish now. Actually, well, we're talking about, we're talking about whether people believe in creation or not. We're talking about whether someone believes in, we're talking about volcanoes, our child's not going to turn into a volcano. A lot of the things have to be, we're talking about someone's experience of something. And that doesn't mean that we have to experience it, but we have to understand the experience. And I'm sure everyone has had the chat with parents of going, at some point your child is going to meet someone from a different culture or someone with different opinions, and it's about how to deal with that, and we are merely preparing them for that and trying to give them a wider view. But I think one of the things that I do is when I'm doing interfaith events, I will put on a hijab. Doesn't mean I'm Muslim, but me role modelling that and saying I'm experiencing someone else's religion for a moment to understand what they are feeling, or understand how this feels, doesn't mean that I've just flicked religion. It means that I'm trying something to empathise with the experience, but doesn't mean that I'm suddenly something else.
I think that's right. It's really a key question, isn't it? I'm old enough to remember the arguments about the distinction between RE and RI, and it's exactly that point. Learning about another religion is not instruction in that other religion, it's education about that other religion. And I think that's an absolutely crucial distinction to make, but it has to go beyond merely putting on a hijab. That's, in a sense, part of it, and for younger pupils, it probably is about as far as you can go at that stage. But if I invited you back to my house for chicken soup, that wouldn't help you understand Judaism. And I think part of the difficulty, not merely with education about religion, but the entire interfaith enterprise, again, not that I'm belittling it, but I think the difficulty is that merely having cups of tea with people of different faiths and agreeing that we're all in favour of peace, or serving my food to you and your food to me, is not actually coming to understand the other faith at any level whatsoever. I mean, I remember once being sent on a course when I taught for the Open University, and one of my tasks was to act as a counsellor to disabled students, and I went on a course for counsellors, and I was told to put on a blindfold for 10 minutes, and then I'd know what it was like to be blind. course I don't know what it's like to be blind. I have no conception of what it's like to be blind. I have a conception of what it's like not to be able to see for 10 minutes, knowing that I can take this blindfold off after the 10 minutes. So there's an example from a completely different context that I think everybody can probably engage with, of how different it is trying to understand another person's, another society's, another community's mindset from within, as distinct from merely giving an external description of it. And I think we just have to be realistic that it's maybe not possible to give more than an external description. And what we're trying to do, in a sense, through exercises like this and through the volunteers that Zoe is organising to go into schools, please come forward and ask for them. That's this afternoon's commercial. What we're trying to do, in a sense, is to make that only one external viewpoint, rather than an external viewpoint of an external viewpoint, which is inevitably what you get if a non-Jewish teacher is teaching from a textbook written by a non-Jewish author about the Jewish religion.
Also on the other parent thing, if they are concerned, then send them our way if you are nervous about that conversation.
I would add to that parents issue, from our perspective, and again a very personal perspective. My own view is that you're far more likely to understand yourself the more you understand other people. Yes. And every parent wants their child to understand both themselves and other people. So learning about other people and their traditions and their beliefs and their way of life seems to me absolutely crucial to a young person's education. And I think, beyond that, certainly communicating to parents that, we know what happens in the world when people don't learn about each other and when they don't listen to each other and when they start to build up views about each other which are based in goodness knows what. And the best way to deal with that is to help young people to understand and learn. And I can't think of any parent that would not want that to happen. So, I mean, it's not an easy issue, but I think there's pretty good answers to that.
Loads of questions coming in. As quickly as possible.
Sorry, we're taking it.
No, you're fine. Now, one question that's coming from Elaine Tate, she's asking, what's the position of the Scottish Jewish Council on abortion and euthanasia? That would be something that raised up at a secondary level.
We don't have one, because we encompass a community in which different people have different views, and it would be more than my head is worth to attempt to speak on behalf of the entire Jewish community on an ethical issue of that kind. If there were a formal consultation, let's say, about new legislation on the subject, we would put in a single response, but we would reflect the different views within the community.
Excellent, thank you. And Ken Coulter is asking, what would you describe as the living heart of Scottish Judaism? Is it spiritual, personal, moral, reforming society? What's the heart of it? A hard question.
Standing on one leg. I think it's very difficult to give a single answer to that, again, without stereotyping. For different people, it will be different things. Some people are socially Jewish, some people's Judaism consists in their observance of tradition. For some people, it will be feeling part of a historic tradition rather than merely part of a community that has its own rituals and activities and so forth. I think every one of my 10,000 people would give you a different answer to that. But that doesn't mean don't ask them.
So if you want one, I would say mine is something to do with a changing world and my Judaism and how they sort of spiral between each other and work through each other, and each complements the other. But most of the time I have to think about how I'm going to do it. And I like the fact that each time I'm presented with a moral decision or an ethical decision or neither of those decisions, how my Judaism is a filter for how I make those decisions.
And coming back to you mentioned volunteers, just a quick one. Are the volunteers available to visit schools in the Highlands, i.e. Inverness?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. And tying in with that as well is the staff in Margaret Matheson's school are wondering which websites are most reliable for sourcing information. Really, she's going to be taking this forward.
Ours, obviously. No, I mean, it's impossible to answer a question like that, I think, on an occasion like this. Here's an opportunity to email us with the question, and we'll email back with an answer.
We are putting together a paper with the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities and with the Muslim Council of Scotland, a separate paper, and part of that paper will all go on our website, and one of the key issues there, or the key tasks, will be to have a series of as many reliable, authentic websites that you can reasonably trust to give you a pretty balanced view and a pretty authentic view. So watch out the Education Scotland website for that. That's my plug for this afternoon.
That's what I was going to say, make sure that you know where to go. So Education Scotland website you can be looking for as well. And our last question of the evening today is, some of the most difficult issues to deal with in RME have to do with the ones that relate to political issues in the Middle East, and it's tempting to try and avoid them due to fear of giving offence. How can RME teachers approach these when they arise in school? Oh, that's a huge question.
I'd say, I imagine I'll say something and then Ephraim will add. I imagine partly it is being careful of your language, so the difference between a Palestinian state and Palestinians currently, and Arabs and Jews and Israelis. None of those things are currently the same, and using all your words carefully, and making sure you've definitely got the right definition for the right thing. And also possibly, if, again, doing your research, and whether that means just having a phone call with us and we can talk through things, we can send a volunteer out who specifically knows more about this kind of thing, because even with our volunteers we'd say this is a really difficult subject, so we do sympathise with the difficulty of it. I'd say trying to, if a question like that comes up in RME, almost literally going, okay, we're pausing with religious stuff here and we're moving to political stuff, and signposting that difference. This is not necessarily an argument between Jews and Muslims, this is an argument between different political and geographical people. Religion is sort of a side aspect of this political argument. So I think signposting that as much as possible, and then getting as much information as you can before starting.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with a word of that. Zoe would probably be surprised. But absolutely right. Make sure of your language. Make sure that you do not take sides on the political issue. Make sure that you set the issue up in terms which are themselves objective. Do not use politically biased sources on either side. Make sure that your factual grounding, and this is perhaps more history and politics than it is directly RME, but I'm not trying to erect a solid wall round RME, but make sure that everything that you're basing yourself on is based on fact and not on somebody's prejudice. I recently heard a very senior civil servant refer to the distinction between evidence-based policy, which we're all supposed to be in favour of, and policy-based evidence. And I think that's a distinction that can be followed through into other spheres as well as the making of government policy. We need to be absolutely clear that we start with the evidence. And I'm not going to object if you reach a different conclusion from me, but we have to have a rational discussion about it. If you start by nailing your flag, literally or figuratively, to one mast or another, then we can't have a rational debate because you've already made your mind up. And I think that is the key word of advice in all of this, is to remain objective and check your sources.
Okay, well, not nearly long enough. I think we could have gone on here for 3 or 4 more hours without any trouble at all. Can I just take the chance to thank all of you folks who've signed up for this today, both for the learner event and for the practitioner event. We will be back in touch with you to follow this up, to find out what you felt about it, what you think we might do next as far as this is concerned. And if it's okay with you, we'll probably add you to an email list so you'll be bombarded with things from Education Scotland in a very good way. I'd like to take a chance to thank Ephraim and Zoe, Marguerite, who's out of the camera at the moment, and to the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities and Giffnock Synagogue for putting up with us today, and I think providing a really, really beneficial event for both learners and practitioners to do what we're here to do at the end of the day, and that is help young people to learn and to understand and to make the world a better place, because that's why we do this job. So I'd like to thank you all for that. Thanks to Jane, our director over there, and